Today we're also joined by Dan Siegel. Siegel is a civil rights attorney at the Oakland-based law firm, Siegel and Me. He has served as both general counsel and interim executive director of Pacifica Radio Foundation, and he has served as a director on both the Pacifica National Board and the local station board of KPFA FM in Berkeley. And in 2006, he completed an 8-year tenure on the Oakland Unified School District Board of Directors. He specifically in regards to the presentation today, he was a student activist in 1967 while attending UC Berkeley. He was a leader in the local Students for Democratic Society, so SDS. At UC Berkeley, he was a UC Berkeley president-elect in student president-elect in 1969, and he's known for his role in Bloody Thursday. Famously, he shouted, "Take the park." So, give it up for Siegel.
Thanks for being here and inviting me to come. Some other veterans in the room will correct me if I misstate history or exaggerate my role in it, which is a good thing. And you can all do the same. You know, I want to start out by commenting on the film, because the film was very nice pictures, nice music, everybody's having a great time. But I think that the image that's presented there fundamentally misconstrues what People's Park was all about. Okay? I think of People's Park as an important chapter in the struggle of people on the campus and in the community here in Berkeley for kind of self-determination regarding the university, its property, its facilities, which really begins in the free speech movement. I wasn't here in 1964, but it's the reason I came to Berkeley a couple of years later. What the free speech movement was about, and people disagree, tell me, but the free speech movement was about was the right of students who had participated in the civil rights movement, who went to the South in the summer of '64 and came back to Berkeley and said, we want to be able to organize on the Berkeley campus in support of the fight for civil rights. And so they set up tables on Sproul Plaza. And the university said, you couldn't do that. You know, it's not an area of free speech. We don't have free speech at Berkeley. We have university speech. And of course, that set off the free speech movement, which lasted for weeks, which led to hundreds, maybe even 1,000 people being arrested, which led to protests, and which led for the first time in UC Berkeley history to the notion that people could set up tables on Sproul Plaza and also have rallies on the steps of Sproul Hall every day during the lunch hour. Right? So free speech, and that's how people had to fight for it. It didn't end then. I came here as a law student in September 1967, and the reason I came was because it was Berkeley. I'll tell you the truth, when I left the East Coast in my car, I didn't know where Berkeley was. It could have turned out to be a suburb of Fresno or LA. I wouldn't have known the difference. I probably wouldn't have stayed for 50 years, but it turned out to be here. And I was thrilled to be here. I had been a student at a small college in upstate New York. I went south in '65 to register voters in both North Carolina and Mississippi. I had my run-ins with the KKK in Mississippi and with sheriffs, but fortunately, at least for me, I left there in one piece, unlike some of our comrades, right, who were murdered down there and who were buried underground in Mississippi. But I came to Berkeley and found myself in a place where there wasn't a dozen people, as there was in my SDS chapter at Hamilton College or Friends of SNCC chapter, but thousands of people. And it was obviously a great place to be. But it was not a peaceful place to be. During my second week in law school, there was an action downtown Oakland called Stop the Draft Week. And it was a very important action at roughly on Clay Street between 15th and 16th, where people from Berkeley and other colleges and universities and the community went down there to disrupt the draft by putting our bodies on the line. And what we were met, I don't know if people know that area of downtown Oakland, where is that city garage, which is now closed for earthquake repairs. But in October of 1967, when people blocked the streets, hundreds of cops who were waiting in the garage came out of the garage and frankly beat the crap out of us. I got clubbed in the head. Hundreds of other people did. We came back to campus and we wanted to organize on campus to build support for anti-draft protests and other activities. And the university said you couldn't. And in fact, if you tried to, people were suspended. So we had something called the Movement Against Political Suspensions in the fall of '67. And we fought with UC, we occupied Sproul Hall, all of Sproul Hall. Literally hundreds of students occupied Sproul Hall until the university backed down on these suspensions. But it didn't stop there. The next fall of '68, we started out with the Third World Strike, a little later in the fall, where students of color throughout the university, following the lead of students at San Francisco State, where it started the same fall, began to have protests on the campus in order to admit more students of color, to hire faculty of color, and to create an ethnic studies program. And I believe that in the entire history of Berkeley, that was the bloodiest sets of demonstrations that ever occurred. In my view, it was the fact that it was led by students of color that provoked previously unknown levels of police abuse and violence against people who were protesting. I personally saw San Francisco cops near Sproul Plaza pull their handguns and point them at students who were protesting and attempting to block access to the college. For a while, the university decided that there would be no more rallies or protests every day at Sproul Plaza at noon, and a group of us, about 15 law students, because we thought that we could use our privilege as law students to defy the university, had a rally on the Sproul Hall steps in violation of the university's ban. And in fact, it worked. Our privilege was successful in that situation, and rallies resumed. But more importantly, ultimately, the university gave in to the students' demands, established the ethnic studies departments, which have become now multiple departments at the university. You know, that's the same year, the next year, we began with anti-war protests, larger than ever. But with respect to People's Park was a nice event, or it was a series of events. And you see the pictures of people planting flowers, planting trees, having a great time. And people did, but it was serious. It was a serious effort to reclaim land. And it was done in solidarity with the idea that this was Ohlone land, and that the Ohlone people had lived here long before the Spaniards and before white people came to this area and occupied the land. So it was partially that. It was also a reaction to the lack of open space in this area. The piece of property that became People's Park was literally a dump. It was a dump in the sense that if you walked over there, it was full of garbage, completely full of garbage. Previously, there had been housing there, relatively low income, affordable housing that was occupied by students. The university bought the property, knocked down the housing. There were a lot of people who believed that the reason they knocked down the housing was because a lot of activists lived in that housing, and it was close to campus. And someone in the administration apparently thought that if you knocked down the housing, maybe the activists would go away. Didn't quite happen, but it was a good try on their part. But it was also, it was a mess. People parked there. It was kind of one of these do-it-yourself parking lots. It's full of cars, full of trash. And when the idea was to reclaim that land and to put a park there, there was a lot of support. A lot of people came from the campus, from the community, built it up. Everyone is familiar with the ideal of the grass and the other plants and people just having a good time there. And that part of it is true. I lived over on Bowditch Street between Durant and Channing at the time, in a little house that no longer is there, but it was right in the shadow of the Durant Hotel. So the People's Park was very accessible to me, and spent some time there. But every morning, you go out to the sidewalk and pick up the newspaper, and you could see people in the park and people going there. And there was a lot of tension in the community because the university administration at that time was headed by a guy named Roger Hines, who was the chancellor, and he was unhappy that people had built the park. Unclear why he was unhappy that this parking lot, this dump, had been cleaned up and smoothed over and people were using it. Maybe it was the fact that people were using it without permission and without the control of the university administration. But regardless of that, from the time that it was set up through May 15, 1969, Hines was issuing threats and telling people that they're going to leave and have to leave, and the university was going to reclaim the property. And there was a lot of opposition to that. And part of it was the activism of the day, but I remember one day, I think it was the 14th, there was maybe 20 or 30 mothers. Those days, it was mainly mothers that took care of kids, but mothers pushing their small children in strollers to demonstrate outside of Hines's office here at California Hall. And many of us did not believe that the university was going to do anything about it because it seemed like such a benign situation and a positive experience for the community. But obviously it turned out that we were wrong. During that spring, I was elected student body president on a platform of basically having the student movement, the anti-war movement, take leadership over the student government. Up until that time, the student government was pretty much run by the Greeks and was very much divorced from the anti-war and other activism on campus. And we put together a slate. I ran along with a man named Floyd Ewan, who ran as executive vice president. And he was one of the leaders of the Third World Strike coming out of the Asian community on campus. And Bill Hasty, who was an African-American student on campus. And for good measure and for unity, we included a sorority member as our fourth student officer. And we won overwhelmingly. Out of 6 or so slates on the ballot, we had 60% of the vote for our slate. It showed that there was strong support for student activism on the campus at that time, which in fact there was. So one morning, get up and go out to get my newspaper on the sidewalk, and I look down the block, and there's a million cops standing around People's Park. They were from the California Highway Patrol, and we were putting the fence up. So it didn't take long to figure out that the topic of today's 12 o'clock rally at Sproul Plaza was going to be People's Park. During that period of time, there was a rally every day. If you wanted to have a rally to support classified workers on the campus, to talk about what's going on in Vietnam or dozens of other places around the country, women's rights, the beginning of the gay rights movement, you wanted to have a rally at Sproul Plaza, you could, but you had to get online because the plaza was literally booked every day. But we knew whoever had reserved it for that day was going to yield to a discussion at People's Park. And I went over there at just right around 12 o'clock. The plaza was packed. There were probably 5,000 to 6,000 people there waiting for the rally to start, and it did. And I didn't know very much about what was going to happen, or at least what was planned. Mike may have known what was going to happen, but Frank Bardicky and Big Bill Miller and others who had been meeting around People's Park had a plan, and I knew they would present the plan. We didn't have rallies or demonstrations at or around the Berkeley campus in those days without a plan. Someone was going to come and say, look, this is what we think we should do. So I was walking over there, and someone said to me, hey, Dan, you should speak. Because someone said I was student body president-elect, and so I did. And it was right around 12:25, and I spoke, and my speech was insightful, perhaps inciting, and I did finish by saying, go down there and take the park. And that led to other issues, which I won't describe unless people want me to. But I did so with the very clear understanding that this was not going to end the rally. There are people waiting to speak, including from the coordinating committee. Tom Hayden was there waiting to speak. Everybody knows who Tom Hayden is, I hope. Michael Lerner, now known as Rabbi Lerner.
It was his rally.
Was it his to begin with? But Mike Lerner is the editor of Tikkun, the magazine, and has continued in his kind of brand of activism. I finished speaking. The equipment went off. The microphone went dead. And behind me, people going, Dan, why did you do that? Well, why did you end the rally? I was going to speak. No, I was going to speak. And people really were waiting to speak. But the cops turned off the sound equipment when I was done. And so people started to drift down Telegraph Avenue. And drift really is the right word. Although Governor Reagan went on TV later that evening and talked about the mob that was running and kind of fighting its way down Telegraph Avenue. I mean, that's complete bullshit. I might have been happy if it was that way, but it wasn't. You see the pictures, people kind of walking down the street arm in arm. You see little kids with balloons. Again, people pushing strollers. It was a quiet scene until people got to the corner of Haste and Telegraph, and there were already a couple of hundred people there, and there were a lot of cops there, and somebody threw something, I don't know, a bottle or a piece of concrete at the cops, and that's all it took for all hell to break loose. And they started beating people, shooting people. The Alameda County sheriffs were there. The sheriff at that time was a guy named Mad Dog Madigan, who was the sheriff of Alameda County. Later, one of our friends named Stu Jalbert, who was one of the first group of yippies with Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, ran against Madigan for sheriff, and Stu always walked around with a pig on a leash, and the pig was called Pegasus, and the idea was elect a real pig to be sheriff. But in any case, it was not any laughing matter, because although they later claimed it was a mistake and the shotguns were supposed to be loaded with birdshot, they were loaded with buckshot. And they shot over 70 people. And one man was just standing on the roof of the Telegraph Repertory Theater, which is on Telegraph, heading south just past Dwight Way, was killed. James Rector, shot by the sheriffs. And another man who worked at the theater, named Alan Blanchard, was blinded. So this is what the cops were about. Just back to the Sproul Plaza for a sec. I was charged with inciting to riot. Governor Reagan made me very proud that evening because he denounced the students at Berkeley for being stupid enough to elect me as the student body president. But I was charged with inciting to riot, and later on, through the process of discovery that you have in a criminal case, we were able to obtain, the evidence from the DA's office and from the police. And one of the things that was very interesting is when they turned over a tape of my speech, after I'm finished, you could hear on the tape that the cops turned over all the people talking to me, including people saying, Dan, why did you do that? Why did you do that? And we knew, of course, that the sound equipment was turned off immediately when I finished speaking. So we wondered how it was that all the rest of this happened to be on the tape. And it turned out that in the microphone that was attached to the speaker stand, there was another little microphone, and they didn't have wireless in those days, but it was connected by a wire into the basement.
So I just left over the library.
It's all right. You probably sleep through this too. But it was connected to a tape recorder in the basement of Sproul Hall. And so the cops were taping everybody's speeches. And that's how we actually learned about that practice. In any case, all hell broke loose on May 15th. They said a man was killed, a man was blinded, lots of other people were hurt. There began a series of protests which lasted for just about 2 weeks until the big march, which is shown in the film. Most of the footage in the film of people marching, and you see the signs, people from Utah and Seattle and Oregon, that was all on May 30th. That was the end. That's when there was literally 30,000 people in the streets of Berkeley. But what happened over the next 2 weeks was, well, one, it was, I think, a very morale-building demonstration of where students and community members were at. We had protests every day. Some of them ended better than others. One that didn't end so well was there was a march of about 500 people that was, I guess the current word is kettled. It was bottled up by the police on Center Street between Fulton and Shattuck, and everybody was arrested and taken out to Santa Rita. I happened to avoid that, but people were taken out to Santa Rita, and they were put in this big concrete cement area out there, and they were told to lie down on the cement and shut up. And if they didn't say anything or move, Alameda County sheriffs were going up and down through this line of people all night with their billy clubs, and if someone's tried to get up, or if someone said anything, they got whacked. Right? So that was, there was, I think, a play made about that called The Night at Santa Rita. Eventually, they brought in the National Guard. You saw pictures of all the soldiers there, and the place was literally occupied by the Army for over a week. It was interesting because many of us were involved in the anti-war movement, and here the war had literally come home. But we always talked about bringing the war home, and this was an opportunity for the soldiers to accommodate us. Most of the soldiers, as you can see in the pictures, are really young and didn't know what the hell to do. And people would go up and put flowers in the barrels of their guns and things like that. One of my favorite stories of that time was Pete McCloskey. I don't know if people know who he is or remember who he is. He was a Republican congressman from San Mateo County who was a Vietnam War veteran and had become anti-war. And in those days there was actually some diversity of opinion in the Republican Party. They weren't all exactly like Trump or Lindsey Graham or the rest of those idiots. But so McCloskey was a pretty gutsy kind of guy and outspoken, and he came to Berkeley to see what was going on. And I was showing him around, and we ran into some National Guardsmen who challenged him and said, "What are you doing here? You can't go there, you can't go there." And he pulls out his wallet, he's got his Congress badge. He says, "I'm a member of the United States Congress, and you can't tell me what to do." And they all kind of backed down and freaked out. So things were, and I'm going to end in a minute. I know people want to talk. But people, the situation was not resolving. Students and other activists continue to take to the streets every day. On one occasion, the National Guard sent a helicopter up and they decided to tear gas us all. It which turned out to be a big stupid mistake on their part, because they also wound up tear gassing Cowell Hospital and just about every classroom on campus. So that did nothing but add further support for what we were about. We were, at the end, undermined by liberals. I don't know how you all feel about liberals, but I've never felt really fond of liberals. When people say to me, "You're very liberal," I say, "No, I'm not liberal at all," and I'm not. But they decided that they had to make peace. So some other members of Congress, including a guy named Alan Lowenstein, came to Berkeley, and they decided, we're going to make peace. And the strategy that they developed and effectively imposed was to have this big peaceful march on May 30th. And it was a big peaceful march. It was at least 30,000 people. People came from all over the West Coast, San Diego to Washington. It was a very peaceful march. Went through the streets of Berkeley. We proved, quote unquote, that we could be peaceful, even to the extent that some of us didn't particularly want to be peaceful. But that kind of ended it. The National Guard went home. People went home. Those of us who were still hanging around went and decided to create another People's Park, which is on the Hearst Strip. People know that area of Berkeley, that strip of green property that goes along Hearst Street. And so for a while that summer, that was another People's Park.
Ohlone Park.
Ohlone Park, yeah. And people occupied and lived there. And the story goes on. And as you probably know, it wasn't too long after all that people tore down the fence. University put up the fence, people tore down the fence, the university put up the fence. After a while, they got tired of putting up fences, and People's Park became what it is today, pretty much. There it is. What do we do now?
Q&A, so are there any questions about the presentation?
Oh, you said you weren't liberal. What would you describe yourself as?
Radical. Radical or revolutionary.
Right.
And, thinking that basically that U.S. society was not going to be productively changed through reforms that may have made things a little better, but would only be changed through what I call radical reforms, which are reforms that change the balance of power. So if you think about something called Citizens United, and the idea that corporations can buy elections in this country, I think a radical reform would be a declaration that corporations aren't people. Corporations don't have free speech rights. Corporations don't have rights to spend all their money to elect their flunkies to political office, as just one example.
What are your thoughts about the Board of Regents owning land then? If corporations aren't people, how does the Board of Regents own People's Park?
That's a good question and a challenging question. The Board of Regents is really a government agency. So I think it's fair to talk about what powers government agencies should have and should not have. A lot of what I do as a lawyer, and some people say it's because I never grew up, but is fighting the regents. I have a lot of cases here at Berkeley, whether it's representing students who have been arrested for this or that, or being involved in what I would call the farm, down in Albany Village, Occupy the Farm, which is kind of another People's Park, but fighting also with the university over tenure decisions, particularly involving women of color and all people of color. And one of the things you run into, which is really something interesting to talk about, is that the Regents is not just a public agency in California. It's what's called a constitutional public agency. And what that means is that its authority is greater than other public entities. So the regulations of the Regents, say, which deal with faculty discipline, have the status of laws passed by the legislature. And so the courts are required to kind of defer in a very major manner to university decisions. And a lot of people don't understand that. And one of the kind of funny or interesting ramifications of it is that if you have a lawsuit against California State University and a similar lawsuit against the Regents, against UC, it's much harder to win against the Regents, even though the issues may be exactly the same.
Any other questions?
Michael, what do you have to say?
Well, real time here. I sort of like your opinion too. So, in the last few years, after I had a little chance at my FBI file and reading through it, and I realized that a few times I was set up. You know, they got me to move to New York for a year actually through a setup. They took a deal where they set up something and I got blamed for it. And I took a deal to get out of town for a year, had court probation for a year. But what I'd sort of like to throw into this is, along with this is, what is sort of now, we're living a lot of sort of what happened to us in this process of when Regan, I feel Regan with Roy Cohen and his mafia set us up and shot us up at the fire hydrant. That started with the sheriffs. And the end result is sort of what we have now, Trump. And we're sort of living a Roy Cohen life still. So I'd like to just throw that in. I was across the street where the fire hydrant was, at Cody's. And I saw people throwing what came out of the news was these wrought iron bars. And at the time, oh, so what? But I didn't recognize them. I've been here for a long time. I didn't recognize who's throwing the bars. I guess it's my contention that those bars were thrown by provocateurs one way or another. And they got the sheriffs, they gave the sheriffs an excuse to go down to their van and pick up the shotguns that were preloaded. A half buckshot and half birdshot being first. And they started to shoot us up. And a lot of this will come out where the book on the 50-year anniversary by Heyday. And one of the things that Tom found out, which I'm trying to remember what it was, is, first of all, another side story, just it's sort of weird. Let's take Blanchard, the guy that was killed, I mean not killed, shot up and blinded. He doesn't admit that ever happened to him in his life. His children don't know it, his wife don't know it. Just a weird thing. I'm just throwing out things that could be of interest. So Regan did this to us, and in the process, we were the first white campus that was starting to be shot up at the time. Started in '67 in Hoboken, or New Jersey, where they killed 21 blacks at the community, and it developed into a real war against us. But the People's Park was the first where they attacked whites, in a sense. And I guess what I'm really trying to amplify here is the thing is still going. And with Trump, my fear is now in this confrontation that we're setting up now is that in 2020, a year from now, at the summer, when we supposedly will have this confrontation, we will duplicate what the hell happened 50 years ago, 51 years by that time. And Trump will use that as an excuse to declare a national emergency, and he will put troops on the polls and right at the election time and influence 2 or 3% and get elected again. I think that's why he doesn't declare the national emergency now, because it will be burnout by the time of election time. But if he pulls it right before the election, let's say he goes into Iran, we start to demonstrate here, we start to demonstrate other places, we got a little bit out of control, and then he closes his emergency. That's my fear. My fear is I'm part of setting this whole situation up to where he could be reelected again.
Well, that's a pretty sad scenario. Does everybody know Michael? Have you spoken to this class?
Last week.
Okay, so everybody knows. I mean, Michael was one of the people who really started this thing. And I just want to support what you said about the government, right? Because it seems now almost fantastic that the government would do the kinds of things that it did. But it did. You know, there was this COINTELPRO, this counterintelligence program that was started by the FBI, by J. Edgar Hoover, and its main target was the Black Panther Party, which Hoover said was the most dangerous phenomenon in the United States today and was going to undermine the country. And this was a justification. And, you know, it's come out, you know, bit by bit over the years, but they set up the Panthers. They sent in provocateurs to not only get Panther chapters in different parts of the country to do things that would justify police violence against them, but they also, and more insidiously, literally send people in to get Panthers to fight among themselves, right? And there were several actual Panthers who were murdered by other Panthers because agents had fostered feuds, suspicions that people's others, significant others, partners were cheating on them and things like that. And several people lost their lives because of that. And that was done consciously by the government to undermine the Black Panther Party. And so it's not at all odd or weird to think that they sent provocateurs into a demonstration in Berkeley or anywhere else to throw rocks and justify police violence. And so that's part of their bag of tricks. And the difference between 1969 to 1970 and now, which actually adds more to be concerned about to Michael's scenario, is the level of intelligence that they have now and the kind of electronic communications. We didn't worry then that there was someone 300 yards from this room using some type of directional equipment to record everything that we're talking about here without actually having someone sitting in the room with a tape recorder that might go off and help us target that person. And there's so much intelligence, which I think is a real potential impact on our ability to fight with the government and how we fight.
Some people, including Robert Reich, thought there, and I think there were agent provocateurs at the Milo rally, dressed as Black Bloc, very shiny boots. Michael, you'll
Yeah.
I missed the first two classes. Where is People's Park today?
Where is it today?
I mean, with its future.
We're-
I'm not the expert on
Yeah,
this. I mean, I'm an onlooker from downtown Oakland, but I'm sure other people here can. And someone want to say something about that? Anybody who's engaged now? Yeah.
It's in between Dolores Park, a forest, and a vacant lot. There's a struggle happening right now. But right now it's a beautiful landscape that and it's sheltered people. And so far there's been aggression, but it's still a wonderful place, yeah.
Is there a risk of losing it as a park at this point?
Very simple.
Is that why this is happening in these classes?
Theoretically, in 2020, the university, we feel that we will stop the university from building on the park in 2020. However, that is the plan. It's to build student housing on the park in beginning of 2020.
So they already have plans to do that? They've started the process? Wow.
And when I heard the chancellor wants to build housing and then reserve some for homeless people,
That's how they're divided.
Yeah,
kind of
that's
try
how
to
they-
co-op people.
Yeah, there's, and they're not even, it's only, they're gonna offer the land to an affordable housing developer who, at that point, would then try to take on the project and build for some, attractive homeless people. They don't, they want some nice looking homeless people over there, Tiny ones,
How do you say?
yeah.
What are you gonna say?
Oh, I just wanted to add, like, in this current context, at least from an undergraduate perspective, I know that many of my peers, and myself frankly, have struggled kind of between the housing crisis and the need for affordable housing versus keeping the tradition and history of People's Park alive and that community aspect of the land. So I know that there's like a lot of divisions there and kind of ambiguity, because I think that it obviously isn't that black and white where you're choosing between one or the other. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, I think that's interesting, and I was gonna ask how people on the campus felt about it. It seems to me that Carol Christ is pretty slick in terms of what her plans are and saying just that, right? If they're gonna, put up a scientific lab there to create more GMOs, she wouldn't have much support. But, oh yeah, affordable housing, that's a good thing, we all need it.
There's 8 other places, I think, we're thinking, including that farm, the big farm on 4th and Oxford.
Yeah, clearly, it's not the only place in Berkeley where you can build student housing, but, kind of making that the choice is a smart one, I think. But do those of you who are students think that students would react or will react strongly to an effort to develop the park, or is it kind of, no longer such a big deal?
They'll be confused and divided.
I think a lot of students don't really know the history at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have, a lot of people just think it's kind of a place where people find refuge and there's a lot of drugs and they feel dangerous, like near the park. And so I'm sure from step back standpoint, people are like, oh, that's a fine idea, for some people.
And I think in '69, there was just such a history, as I was laying out at the beginning, of struggles over university facilities and programs and things like that, that people saw it that way. It wasn't just a piece of grass or a place where people hung out. Another one I didn't mention earlier, in May of 1968, we had something called the Vietnam Commencement. The draft was in full-fledged at the time, and we wanted to organize an alternative commencement service. And thought it'd be nice to do it in the Greek theater, just like a real graduation. And Reagan and the Regents got together and said, no, you can't do it. You can't do it in the Greek theater, you can't do it anywhere. So we did it on the Sproul Hall steps. And the administration said they were going to break it up, they wouldn't let it happen. And something happened which I don't think has occurred since, which is about 250 faculty members came out and made a semicircle up on Sproul Plaza to put several layers of teachers between those of us who were speaking at this commencement thing and the police. And so we were allowed to do it. But that, again, that was just 1 year before People's Park, and that was really part of our campus experience.
How much influence does the governor have over this point?
I think he could make whatever he wants to happen here.
You think he would be influenceable?
I think everybody's trying to figure out what Newsom's going to be about and how he chooses to spend his political capital. Be interesting. I mean, just one of the things I work on is prison litigation. And we were involved in this case that ended solitary confinement in California prisons. And Jerry Brown and Kamala Harris were not much help to us. In fact, they were obstacles. Whether Newsom's going to be more interested in humane treatment for people in prisons remains to be seen.
I just want to invite people, because it's 6 o'clock, so we're technically over, so the people who have to leave at 6 can leave, but we can continue the Q&A.
So, as a leader for UC Berkeley, right now we have an unoccupied chancellor's mansion, and then we have People's Park. What would you say is priority for development at this point? Like, if you had to choose between those two, what would you say?
Well, I think your question contains its answer, right?
Some people.
Yeah. So where's Carol Chris live? She doesn't live in the mansion?
In the hills.
Oh, she's got a little place in the hills?
Yes.
One room, one bedroom?
Long ways away.
Yeah.
Just make sure the sign is.
This is a little bit off topic, but I was just curious. What was Kamala's stance on the work that you're doing in prisons?
Whose stance?
Kamala Harris. Because you mentioned that she was an obstacle to some reforms.
When we litigate these cases, it's interesting
Sign up on the side.
that we get attorneys from the Attorney General's office and attorneys from CDCR to fight us, and they fought us. I mean, this case is called the Ashford Case. It began in 2011 when two prisoners brought the case pro se, meaning they filed on their own behalf. Guy's named Todd Ashker and another guy named Danny Troxel. And that led to a big hunger strike in 2011 and a huge hunger strike involving about 30,000 prisoners in 2013. And there was a lot of emphasis and impetus to end solitary confinement, and finally the state came to the table and essentially under pressure from the courts, because our judge made it pretty clear that if the case ever went to trial, she would rule in our favor. And Anthony Kennedy, the Supreme Court judge, who was replaced by Kavanaugh, kind of gratuitously said that he thought that solitary confinement was torture. So those are the things that really brought the prison system to the table. And, you know, I have real mixed feelings about Kamala Harris.
No shit.
It was that, and, you know, I'm active in a group called the Anti-Police Terror Project in Oakland, which is an organization that focuses on police terror, as the name might indicate. And we've been involved in a lot of different cases involving mainly African-American prison or people who were murdered by the police in Oakland and elsewhere. And we never got any help from the Attorney General's office. We had a big rally in Sacramento a couple of years ago, and families of a lot of people who had been murdered by the police from all over the state were up there. And got this coffin and put it in front of her office, and each of the mothers of one of the young people who was murdered put a rose in it. She never spoke with us, never indicated that she was concerned about the issue. I'm sure we were not invisible to her. Yeah. Now she's, now she's got the line, Medicare for all and free education and all the things that we're all in favor of. So we'll see.
Why is it that, like, today there's not as much people in the park, but as opposed to, like, in the past where it was just a bunch of different people? Is it because there's a lot of misconceptions, like, with the park? Like, maybe the police might have said a lot of bad things about it? Like, I just wonder why it's not as populated anymore.
But Michael knows the answer to that question better than I do.
Well, we have a class problem in this society. As things have been getting rougher and rougher, they say that the people that are on the bottom of the society have seen the park as a place where they can, there's assets there, there's service, it's a refuge. But it's a class society, so not only, I mean, there are white people now, we have black, we have a multiple situation. Well, the society suffers from a lot of racism and a lot of classism. They're basically afraid of us. And then they go along with the university sort of amplifying that we're sort of like what Trump says. That's their chance of saying almost the same thing, you know, about us. So, I mean, you're coming from a situation, you've gone through a propaganda thing that they told you, right? Didn't they tell you not to hang out at the park? And all these things. That's real. I mean, if you don't know better, if you don't hear from us, and going down there's a little difficult if it's a place where there's all kinds of things you don't want, you're afraid of. So I would say they work pretty well. We're coming along, we're changing the attitude, but look at the size of this book, look at the wealth there. It's a hard obstacle to challenge. Have you win any cases against the university?
Oh, yes.
You do?
I don't know, anybody take any math classes? Jenny Harrison, who is one of the, my view, stars of the math department, was denied tenure because she's a woman. I think there's no other, you get to the bottom line, there's no other justification for it. And this was the first tenure case we took up, and Chancellor Tien was the chancellor at the time. And ultimately, after we beat the hell out of the math professors for months in depositions, Chancellor Tien agreed that he would create a committee of people who would evaluate Jenny's qualifications for tenure, and then decide if she did get tenure at what rank. And so there was a fair committee that was created, and they evaluated her qualifications, and they said she should get tenure, and Chancellor Tien said she should get tenure as a full professor, and she did. So that was one. Another case that we did around here, does anybody take any classes in the College of Natural Resources? So Ignacio Chapella, one of the professors there, worldwide crusader against GMOs. He came up for tenure, and his case was different. I mean, you know, cases are different. You learn the system. Jenny was torpedoed by people in her department. There, in the whole history of the math department, there had only been 2 women previously who had gotten tenure. It was a pretty big department. It was just a totally sexist place. But in Ignacio's situation, he was overwhelmingly approved by his department, by his chair, by his college, by his dean, by something they call an ad hoc committee, which is sort of a quality control committee for faculty. And he was vetoed at the highest level by the budget committee, which is, it's kind of a misnomer. They call it the budget committee. It's really sort of a personnel committee. And one of the people on that committee was a professor named Professor Jalbert. And Jalbert was like a big beneficiary of research funding by the companies that create GMOs. So they vetoed him. So we brought that lawsuit, and they very quickly settled because they realized it just wasn't going to work. I mean, you know, you learn things about the university, some of which you didn't know, and some of which you wish you'd never know. But the process is actually, the tenure process is very predictable. You know, if you started to do multiple regression analysis or something like that, if you have a very strong support from your department, meaning that it's either unanimous or just a couple of dissenters, you have about a 98% chance of getting tenure at any UC campus. And the other levels are, I mean, they're not quite rubber stamps because it's a somewhat rigorous process, but that's the result. So, you know, when he was denied at the personnel committee, that was such an outlier that we knew that they weren't going to be able to hold that. So, there's some more. Those are some of my 2 favorites.
Were you part of the Occupy the Farm, the Guild Track movement at all?
Yes.
And
You let it down there.
Huh?
You let it down there.
I didn't lead it, but I was in the group that some person unknown to me cut the lock, and people went in there and started setting that up.
so is it forever?
Good job.
Keeping it? Maybe far as you know? But nothing's forever, I know.
Yeah.
Does it look promising?
I mean, what's promising about it is that, but I guess, what's his name, Gillis, who was the dean of the College of National Resources, recently resigned. He decided that it could be a model of urban farming, right? So he kind of, I think, co-opted it. I mean, not in a particularly nasty way, but, you know, at the Gill Tract, it was mainly a place where half a dozen professors did experiments with corn. And it was divided up into these big lots, and, you know, a lot of people grew corn and they did experiments with them. So now, they still do corn on a lot of it, but the couple of acres that have become the Gill Tract Farm is beautiful model of urban gardening, and people plant a lot of stuff and teach kids from the community and other people how to be gardeners, and they feed people. So what could be bad about it?
Wasn't it left in somebody's will to study agriculture?
It was. That will was largely disregarded. Yeah, it was 100 acres, now it's like 9 acres. Thanks. So,
What about
100
the
acres. Wow.
farm on Oxford? Is that a similar situation?
Yeah, except I don't know if it, and I haven't ever really studied the history of that land, but the Gill Tract is, what's your name again?
George.
George, as George says, it was in the will, and it was supposed to be used for agriculture. Yeah.
Isn't that legally binding?
You know, but I say it's a golden rule.
Yeah.
He who has the gold makes the rules. But, yeah, that was
That's how it
fun.
goes.
That was fun.
Dan, you did a good job, good presentation.
Thank you. All right.